From awaytogarden.com and robinhoodradio.com, this is A Way to Garden with Margaret Roach, your weekly invitation to dig in and grow.
With the surge in interest in lawn alternatives and other native choices for ground cover, the genus Carex is always mentioned high up on the list. But which of these grass-like perennials, most of them labeled as best suited to shade, can actually substitute for lawn? And which sedges can serve other landscape roles? A 4-year trial at Mount Cuba Center in Delaware, the renowned native plant garden and research facility, sought to get at those answers and others. More in a moment about sedges, but first this message.
Underwriting support from Color Blends, supplying top-quality, spring-blooming Dutch flower bulbs to landscape professionals and ambitious home gardeners. More information on the web, colorblends.com.
Today's guest, Sam Hoadley, is manager of horticultural research at Mount Cuba, where he and the team trialed 70 different Carex over a 4-year period. Sam's report on the findings is just out, plus he's teaching a virtual class on February 1st on these important native plants, too. Before joining Mount Cuba, Sam was lead horticulturist for Longwood Gardens' Hillside Garden, and he received his degree in Sustainable Landscape Horticulture from University of Vermont. Hi, Sam, and welcome back. You've been hard at work as ever.
Hi, Margaret. Thanks again so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, yeah, I'm one of those crazy kind of people who looks forward to reports like these because, I just feel like I really want the lowdown. You know what I mean? It's just there's so many choices in the world, and especially now with native plants, there's so little information on so many of them. So what you do is this amazing service to gardeners. I think, that's how I regard it anyway.
Yeah, that's the hope. It's just helping people make good informed decisions because there are so many choices, and we try to make the information for plants that'll work for the most people available to nurseries and homeowners.
So before we get started talking about Carex, about sedges, I want to do a giveaway with the transcript of this show over on awaytogarden.com of a couple tickets to your February 1st online event, which I think is going to be really popular because it's definitely a hot topic because they're plants that we know, but yet we really don't know them. They're familiar looking, but which one is which and so forth. So that should be really interesting. So a 4-year trial, what were the aims?
So we were looking at these 70 different plants, a lot of which were commercially available, but some of which were locally native to the Mid-Atlantic region, were provided to us by our state botanist, Bill McAvoy, who is a Carex expert, to say the least. We were really looking at these plants. We wanted to know, how adaptable they were, how versatile they were. We were looking at them grown in full shade, or 60% shade, I should say, as well as full sun. So we had a full set of Carex in both conditions. We wanted to see, push their tolerances, see how they would do in kind of average garden conditions. A lot of these plants you would see, you traditionally associate Carex, or at least what I had known about Carex when we first started this trial is kind of, you think of wet soils, you think of shade, but there's a lot more to them. We kind of wanted to unravel a lot of these common and some of not so common species and kind of see how they would do in our trial gardens over a 4-year period.
Right. So, they're, as I said in the introduction, they're sort of grass-like perennials. There's that little rhyming phrase, sedges have edges. Because since they're grass-like, it can be confusing to tell them apart. What is it? Sedges have edges, rushes are round, grasses are hollow, something like that.
Yeah, there's a few versions, and the first two parts of that rhyme almost always are the same. The last part in regards to grasses, there's a few different versions of it, but some of the versions say, grasses are hollow, and we'll talk about grasses having nodes, which Carex have nodes as well, but grasses have these really swollen kind of joint-like nodes.
Yes.
But one of the best ways to tell most grasses from Carex is that they have a hollow stem that's circular. Carex stems are solid and they're triangular, as well as other sedges. And then deciphering whether that sedge is a Carex or not is the next step.
Right. And we don't even have to go there because I think it would be a miracle if all of us gardeners and people interested in native plants for one reason or another could identify even a half dozen, let alone, I have to acknowledge that I only know 3, really. Pennsylvanica, which is all over the sort of woodland edge of my property, and is, so that's been familiar to me for a long time. And then Plantagenet, whose species name, so Carex plantagenet, I think means with the plantain-like leaf, right?
Yeah, exactly. Both great species, both top performers in our trial.
And then the other one I know because when on the country roads around here, if you pass a wetland on the edge of the road, you'll sometimes see what I always knew as tussock sedge, which kind of stand up like tussocks. Exactly. Little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. No,
in wetlands. And that's Carex stricta, I think. And that's all I know. I don't know any more of them.
Yeah. And I'll tell you what, when I started this trial, I would say I'm still not a Carex expert. But I'm fascinated by them and I'm learning more about them all the time. But when I started, I was probably pretty similar to where you are now. But seeing all these plants next to each other, it really kind of helps untangle this seemingly complex world of Carex. And that's something we really wanted to do for the audience as well, is that it can feel overwhelming, it can feel complicated. And we really aim to, with this report and this trial, to kind of decipher this group of plants and try to make it manageable and digestible for people.
Right. Because gardeners are looking for alternatives to lawn, as I said in the introduction, and for other ground covers. And many of us, especially who have been at it a long time, the ground covers that we planted years ago have turned out, many of them, to be kind of thuggish. They're European or Asian plants that after a long time in the ground become too ambitious, too aggressive. We've got to get rid of them. People might have a bank that they want to underplant, some shrubs or whatever on a bank, hold the soil. They might want, again, ground covers of various types. So some Carex clump and some spread by rhizomes. Is that correct?
That's correct. And some of them can spread quite vigorously, some a little bit more gently. But I would say that, the proportion of plants that spread by rhizomes rapidly in this trial was actually very low. I think we had 4 or 5 species that spread by rhizomes, and eventually spread to cover larger areas. Most of the species in this trial were clump forming. I think that would typically appeal to smaller home gardens, just because, these plants aren't going to overwhelm or overrun the bounds of where they're originally planted. But a lot of the spreading plants won't either. Like you mentioned, Carex pennsylvanica. It's a really great rhizomatous plant. It can kind of weave its way amongst other perennials. It's not going to overwhelm your garden. And I love it because it kind of fills gaps. It helps suppress weeds. And it does just kind of weave its way and kind of forms that base layer of a planting.
Right. So
but there are a couple. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. And so there are some that are thuggish, though.
There are a couple. There were 2 species in this trial that I would label as aggressive. There is a place for those plants. If you have a small home garden, you have other plants that you don't want being overwhelmed. Maybe it's not the right choice, but there are places where this could work. This species could work really well. If you were trying to stabilize like a wet bank, those 2 species that we trialed, Carex trichocarpa and Carex amorii, would be really great options. For wet, sunny meadows, if you're trying to outcompete potentially like other invasive plants, adding those Carex species with other, we'll say, robust native plants might be a really great way to kind of naturally suppress unwanted non-native plants moving into those areas.
Right. And what about the range of size? Because the ones that I just mentioned that I know, they're different sizes. They're not all, similar. And actually their foliage is different sizes as well. Like that Plantagenet, the plantain leaf one, is quite different. It doesn't have a narrow, thin sort of blade-like leaf. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a tremendous diversity of textures and habits and sizes within all of these Carex, even just within our trial. We had plants like Carex eburnia, which has very narrow foliage, less than 1 millimeter in width. And then we had other plants like Carex squamosa. It almost looks like an iris, like has very broad foliage. And then, for sizes, we have plants that are several inches tall, and that's kind of all they get to, with clumps that are maybe 6, 7, 8 inches wide. I'm thinking of Carex eburnia again. That's one of the smaller species in the trial. There are others that are 2 to 3 feet tall. Some that spread, vigorously, like Carex morii and Carex trichocarpa. And we, in the report, we kind of tried to simplify this a little bit. While we do have the measurements and the sizes, we did try to just categorize them into small, medium, and large, just again to kind of give you that quick reference where this plant might fit well into your home landscape.
Right. And so everyone thinks of them as foliage plants, kind of like grasses, and like grasses, they do flower. And some of them, I think, have pretty interesting, almost spectacular flowers in a way, in the way that some of the grasses that we call ornamental grasses also do in some cases. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. No, there are some really beautiful Carex flowers. A couple that come to mind, like Carex Hoadley-A, which was the best Carex in our whole trial, the top performing Carex. Its flowers are stunning. And a lot of Carex bloom kind of in this period between in kind of late April, early May. There's a few others that kind of move into June a little bit. And then we had one oddball Carex that blooms in late July and August every year, but that's kind of the only one in our trial, Carex Janua. Beautiful flowers, kind of an unexpected thing when we first saw it. But there's a lot of Carex, like Carex Hoadley-A, absolutely spectacular, just masses of these kind of straw-colored flowers that are kind of dancing above the foliage in early spring. To me, these are great companion plants for other spring ephemerals. They're just a great complement. It's not just kind of a background plant. It's actively contributing to the beauty and the design of that landscape.
Right. And so with native plants, the other thing a lot of times besides the look and the purpose and the size that we want to, know in advance is, do any insects or other animals use them as food or for any other purpose? I mentioned the tussock sedge, Carex stricta, and, in the nearby boggy sort of wetlands where I am in upstate New York. And I know that bog turtles are, I think they nest or use them as like their little nest. Yeah. I've heard that. So I've never actually seen one do so, but yeah.
No, that's absolutely true. And that's one of the things we wanted to drive home with this trial as well. And a lot of our research, one of the things we're looking at is, not just the beauty of these native plants, but also the value of these native plants, and trying to tell people, which of these native plants that we're trialing that you could add to your home landscape and you'd be supporting wildlife. In a lot of the trials, we're looking at pollinators, and with Carex, most Carex are not insect pollinated, they're wind pollinated. So measuring their ecological value and their wildlife value in the trial was challenging. In the case of the Carex trial, we had a lot more anecdotal evidence of ecological benefit that these plants were offering. We know in the wild that a lot of Carex act as host plants. There's a lot of insects that will actually feed on the foliage, a lot of lepidopterans that will feed on the foliage of Carex. A lot of wildlife, mammals and birds will feed on Carex seeds. So they're providing things, even in your home landscape, to wildlife. Species of frogs and toads in the Carex trial, and we're not really close to any source of water, and this was acting as a refuge, kind of trapping that humidity at the soil layer, at the soil surface, and allowing these animals to kind of have this refugia within the gardens. But you mentioned that I mentioned the bog turtles. And that's actually a really fascinating relationship that the bog turtles do have with Carex stricta. It happens in the mid-Atlantic as well. And Mount Cuba has actually been working with the state of Delaware for the past several years, growing Carex stricta to be planted back out into suitable bog turtle habitats. And we've actually seen the bog turtles nesting in those clumps of Carex stricta, hatching clutches of eggs. So it's been successful. It's fascinating. And it's really it's a really great partnership with the state of Delaware that we've had.
Wow, that's great. See, I'd heard about it, but as I said, I've never seen it. So yeah, and it looks just like a nest. They really do. Yes. The tussock sedges look just like a nest. It's perfect.
Yep.
Yeah. So they're always on the list of shade plants, and so you said in the trials you put. You planted each species that you were evaluating in both a sun location and a shade location, a 60% shade location or something. And so, how was that a big factor? Because, people are looking for lawn alternatives, and normally people's lawn is in, some sun or even full sun. Was that one of the reasons you wanted to know that, or?
That's part of it. And we really just wanted to push their tolerances and see what they would be able to adapt to in kind of average soils in average garden conditions. Mm-hmm. And what we saw is that a lot of these plants are fairly adaptable. They may be better suited, or you may find them in the wild in shadier conditions. But if you give them enough soil moisture in just average garden soils, a lot of them do perfectly fine in full sun, and some of them actually do better, which was really great. And to me, that's a great thing that you can look at a single Carex species. You can use that species to kind of tie in two different garden situations. If you have a shady area next to a full sun area, you can use some of these Carex species to kind of tie both of those garden areas together as kind of a common element. And it really just kind of showed how tough and adaptable a lot of these Carex are and how versatile they are. And there really is a Carex for any garden situation.
Now, we typically will see them sold as plants, not seed. Is that correct at this time?
Yeah, you often do see them sold as plugs and established plants in quart pots and things like that. But there are good nurseries out there that are selling seed. If you'd like to try to grow them from seed, some of them have some interesting dormancies, but it's not entirely too challenging to try at home either. Prairie Moon comes to mind. They have a really good selection of.
Who is that?
Prairie Moon Nursery.
Oh, yes. Great. Okay. All right. And they probably have instructions because, it's probably not like sowing lawn seed. It's not that right. Just, you sow the lawn seed and a few days later it starts to come up. It's not quite like that. So
exactly.
Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. But we're learning more about that, I guess. So before we sort of talk about some of the stars, I wanted to just digress for a minute more or two into, I think the last year of the trial, I think you did mowing testing or something. And
we did.
I'm like, yeah. I was laughing at that part of the report. I'm thinking, I'm just seeing you all out there with your mowers, with these trial plots, wondering how these plants are going to look like what they're going to look like with a haircut.
Exactly. No, it was, we had done our 4-year evaluation. The trial was essentially over. And the way that our trials are rotated in and out, we like to have kind of every year you're rotating out one. So in the case of the Carex, we wanted to hold these plants an extra season so that we would continue on that staggered schedule. So we had these plants sitting there and we were just kind of like, what could we do with this? Is there anything else we could kind of eke out of this trial, anything of value? We kind of decided, we've got the plants here. Let's mow them every 2 weeks. We started in early May, we ended in the end of August, and just see what happens. A lot of people are interested in Carex as a lawn replacement, and there's tons of Carex species that would be a great no-mow lawn replacement, essentially very little maintenance. You maybe only have to mow it once or twice a year. But we wanted to see if there was any that would be a suitable alternative to, traditional mowed lawns, which I think in some situations are more aesthetically acceptable, if you will, in certain plantings. And just see how these plants responded. How tolerant were they? How would they do in full sun and shade? It was just a really interesting opportunity, and we've found some interesting stuff out of it as well. So
which ones did well with being mowed, sort of looked okay and stood up to it? Which were some, you would say, a couple that you would say that were candidates for that, if one wants to be in put them in a situation where they
Sure. Yeah. A lot of the plants, and aesthetics is a big part of it. So what the plants that don't just tolerate it, but also look the part.
Yes.
Carex really did tolerate it, were surprisingly tolerant, even plants that didn't really look like your traditional turf grass. But a lot of these plants didn't just tolerate it, but they looked good. They looked like your traditional turf grass lawn at the same time. While having the added benefits of needing less inputs. We didn't water these plants at all. We didn't fertilize these plants at all. They looked good. They were healthy. They continued to grow. They were vigorous. Carex Hoadley-A was one of those plants, was not just the top performer in the overall trial. It was the top performer in the mowing trial. It looked great in sun and shade when it was mowed. This is just a spectacular species, and I'm really hopeful that this plant will kind of take off in the nursery industry. Carex eburnia, I mentioned earlier. This is that really fine texture. It kind of looks like a fine fescue. It is clump forming, but it spreads very slowly by rhizomes after it's been established for a few years. So it's one of those plants that you would need a few of them to kind of fill an area. With Carex Hoadley-A, what's nice about that species is it is rhizomatous. It will kind of cover ground slowly and will kind of knit together and fill gaps. But Carex Hoadley-A has the added benefit of being able to grow pretty well in drier soils. So if you have an area of dry shade, which is, I think, generally one of those areas that's tougher for turfgrass lawns, this could be a really great candidate to replace turfgrass in those situations.
Interesting. That would be a useful, something useful to have, definitely.
Absolutely. And a couple other species, Carex socialis, did great as a mowed plant. The mowed plants actually outperformed the non-mowed plants in our trial.
Oh.
Carex pennsylvanica, as you mentioned, it was a great plant in the trial, also great for mowing. I think whether we realize it or not, Carex pennsylvanica is probably a component of many of our lawns that are, especially if we live in a naturalistic area. And Carex jamesii was another great plant that did tolerate the mowing and looked great at the same time.
Oh, good. Okay. So, if I had, like, I have a lot of the Pennsylvanica, as I said, at my woodland edge and so forth, and just for maintenance purposes and to knock back any woody invaders that were coming in or successional things that were coming in, I used to, in the early spring, or maybe, yes, in spring, I would take one pass with tractor over them, and they came right back. So would that be the time if we did have a big swath of it? It would a cleanup time. Would that be the time that we did that to it, or do they brown down? I can't even really remember whether I don't think of them as sort of looking all brown and dormant. The way the grass does.
The Pennsylvanica does it is semi-evergreen. So bases of the foliage will remain green over the winter, and mowing them or cutting them back in late winter, early spring is a really great option.
Okay.
I think you can also do it in late fall, early winter. And I think that also has the added benefit of if you have Carex pennsylvanica mixed in with other, say, spring ephemerals or early spring perennials, if you mow it earlier in the year, you're kind of avoiding any interference with those other emerging plants in the spring will be avoided by doing it earlier in the year.
Right. Okay. So if you couldn't be mowing because you're waiting for some ephemerals to come up, like I have it in one area where there's a lot of myanthemum, a little woodland, sort of beautiful little white, delicate native wildflower. Right. And obviously I wouldn't want to go with the tractor over those.
Right.
Early on and so forth. So in the last, we have maybe 3 minutes or so left, and you've shouted out some. What about Plantagenea? Did that perform well? Would that be one? Is that one that does have good use as Plantagenea because it's so distinctive looking? Or what are a couple of other ones that you haven't mentioned in the last couple of minutes that you want to shout out?
Absolutely. So Plantagenea is a great species. We have it planted as kind of a ground cover in certain areas at Mount Cuba Center. We knew it was a great plant. It's commercially available, but it's kind of its best feature is that broad kind of corrugated foliage. It's striking. And it blooms really, really early in the season at a time when not a lot else is happening in the spring garden. I'm talking kind of like mid to late March, these flowers are coming up.
Wow.
And it's one of those plants that it is semi-evergreen. And if you really site it in a protected, shaded location over the winter, it is going to remain essentially evergreen over the winter. And it's one you don't want to cut back too much. It's a little bit slow to respond and reflush in foliage. But it is truly a spectacular species, definitely worth growing in any shady garden. It was not at all.
I have it as like the sort of edge, of some loose beds that are adjacent to some gravel and so forth. And it's sort of just, it just makes a soft, loose edge, and it's very handsome. Those beautiful, fairly wide, as you say, textural leaves. It's quite nice. Yeah.
No, they're lovely. And Carex Hoadley-A, as I mentioned before, really just an outstanding plant. Has great foliage, great flowers, covers ground gently, in a very similar category to Carex pennsylvanica, but in my opinion, just a slightly better plant. It actually suppresses weeds a little bit better than Carex pennsylvanica, if that's what you're looking to do. One of the larger species that we really, really liked in this trial is Carex cherokeyensis, very close to an evergreen plant as well. Larger species, you could use it in mass or even singly. It will really stand up on its own as being a specimen in your landscape. It did well in sun and shade. Really just this deep green, lustrous foliage, really a spectacular species. and Carex stricta and Hoadley-A, two very similar species, but two of my favorites. They have these absolutely spectacular displays of flowers in late April or late May, April, early May. Just truly stunning. It looks like a fireworks display. Both of them were, exceptionally tolerant to shade and sun. Both of these plants, as we mentioned, really are very tolerant and even prefer very wet habitats. Carex stricta, like you mentioned, grows in kind of these tussock little, like self-made islands.
Yes.
But they do fine in average soils as well. I don't know how well they do in drier soils, but in the average soils of the trial garden, they performed really, really well.
Interesting.
Sun and shade.
Well, I'm excited to learn more, and I started, as I said, reading the early version of the report, and I'll give links with the transcript of the show to that, and also to your February 1st virtual event, which I think is so important for people to learn more about these plants, because they are such a great tool in the toolbox for this transition away from some of our endless miles of lawn and other ground covers that don't serve any purpose, really, ecologically. So thank you, Sam Hoadley at Mount Cuba Center. Thank you for the work and for making time today to talk. And I'll talk to you again soon, I hope.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Underwriting support from Color Blends, supplying top-quality, spring-blooming Dutch flower bulbs to landscape professionals and ambitious home gardeners. More information on the web, colorblends.com.
And I hope I'll talk to all the rest of you soon again, too. Now, don't miss an episode. You can subscribe free to the podcast version of the show on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or Spotify. And you can find me anytime at awaytogarden.com. And on Facebook and on Instagram as @awaytogarden. And happy gardening meantime.
Away to Garden with Margaret Roach is a joint production of awaytogarden.com and the smallest NPR station in the nation, Robin Hood Radio.